Hello, it's Miles here at Fabricana. With the dawn of a new era for our YouTube channel, we have launched an online store, so we're going to be making a huge effort to include content in our how-tos that also include links to the products, so if you find something in our videos that you're enjoying, you can also buy the product and get it exactly what we're using. So today's project is this really sweet kind of Japanese style inspired belt. You can tie it around your waist, you can, have a little bit higher, have it across your chest, armor, whatever you like. It is a trending kind of technique of fabric weaving. Of course, we're going to show you the belt specifically, but this would also be a really fun technique for home decor, for pillows, for table runners. You can use it for other garments, maybe a piece of a vest, or anyway, I encourage you to use your creativity. I want to make a note about masks. Right now, obviously, I'm not wearing a mask. We are filming this during COVID restrictions, so you will see during the film that at times I have a mask on, and that is to protect our camera person. What else do I want to say? Of course, I want you to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're enjoying this content. We will always have links in our social media as well through Instagram and Facebook, so please join us there. So I think, one more thing I want to say. I'll be showing you exactly this colorway that we're producing, but I just wanted to show you another kind of trending color. I know for 2021 the Pantone colors are a gray and a yellow, so I also made this kind of prototype. This was the one that I practiced on to make sure that everything was going to go smoothly, and I've done that in kind of a charcoal gray and a nice fun yellow, so that's another option. Use your creativity, please, and please enjoy the video. So the first thing I want to talk to you about, our exciting project, is the fabrics that we're going to use for the actual weaving. We're going to use 100% cotton. We know it's going to press nicely. We know it's going to feed through our bias folder really nicely. So we're using 100% cotton, kind of quilt quality stuff. We're going to be using these beautiful, you probably can't see it, but there's kind of a linen-y texture on these prints. This beautiful taupe and this kind of bright kind of navy color. Here's a few other choices in the quilter's linen as well. It's Beautiful Quality by Robert Kaufman. I'm just going to quickly read off the style numbers. If you like the colors, you can order them. We have another beautiful collection called Dublin that has a nice linen texture as well. I'm showing just a few colors that I thought might work with the kind of Japanese styling that we're doing for this particular project, but there are a lot of other colors available. Again, the name is Dublin. You can probably just look that up on our online store as well. We're also using a different fabric for the ties and straps and backing, and I'm using this beautiful lightweight denim. This is our 5-ounce denim, so hopefully you can kind of see from how it moves. It is quite soft. So now that we've looked at some fabrics, let's talk about the other materials that we'll need for this project. So before we look at the other materials we're going to need, I just want to say hopefully this is one of the last videos that we're going to film basically in a boardroom here. We are working, we have a nice big space built. It's not quite decorated to our liking yet, not quite ready for film, but we hope to be there soon, and we hope to show you some progress of that space as it happens, and then we'll be launching some new videos that'll be filmed there. So looking forward to that. So on to the materials that we need. We need our kind of 3 basics here. Our rotary cutter, we're going to be doing some long straight lines. It's best to use a rotary cutter. Please use it safely. A nice long straight ruler, and of course a self-healing mat. So those 3 kind of go together for cutting. We'll need a nice piece of interfacing, fusible. Very important that it's fusible. I'm using a heavyweight Pellon interfacing. And we need a nice big piece of cardboard, about 6 inches either direction larger than the finished project. Of course, we'll need some scissors for cutting the strips, the ends of the strips. Very important, I'm using a 1/2 inch bias tape folder. It's a really handy little tool. It comes in a package like this. This is the Clover brand, but it is made by other brands too, so find the one that you can find locally. And then of course I'm going to be using some beautiful glass head pins. We are going to be getting the iron close to the pins, so I'm using glass head so I don't need to worry about them melting. So now that we've looked at our materials, we're going to get ready to cut. So the first thing we're going to cut is our fusible interfacing. So the finished size of our project is 5 inches by 16 inches. So we need to cut our interfacing 1 inch bigger on all sides for the interfacing. So I'm going to take 5, that's going to become 7 because it's an inch on either side, and 16 becomes 18 because that's an inch on either side. So I'm just going to take my nice straight edge of my interfacing, and I need 7 inches. Leave that folded, and I know I need 18, so I don't want to waste it. So there is our finished interfacing piece. Then we can move on to cutting some fabric. So I'm going to cut my beautiful blue kind of linen look print here first. Again, I've got one nice straight line that was cut with a rotary cutter already. Now for this one, we're going to use it for our long strips, that's what's called our warp for our weaving if you're a weaver. Hopefully I'm getting that right. So those strips are going to be the full width of the fabric by 1 inch. And I'm going to need 5 of these strips, because each of these strips is going to get cut in half. So that will give me 10 strips altogether. So the next fabric I'm going to cut is this beautiful kind of taupe color, again in this beautiful kind of quilter's linen texture. These are going to be the strips that go across the piece, so they're a lot shorter. So there's unfortunately a lot more waste. So we're going to cut a few more strips of this one so that we know that we have enough strips cut. The strips that go across are actually called the warp, or the weft, I should say, all these W words. So the lengthwise strips are the warp and the crosswise strips are the weft. I'm just going to straighten that out a little bit. Again, I'm going to cut 7 strips of this one. These will get cut into much smaller strips, but I'm going to cut those as I need them so that we don't have any wastage. There are 7 strips for our warp. Now we're going to move on to cutting the denim for the backing, the binding, and our straps. So the last of the fabrics that we have to cut is this beautiful lightweight denim. So we're going to be using this for the back of our project. We're going to use it to bind the outside edge of our project and for the straps. So I'm actually going to cut the straps first. And I want nice long straps, so I'm going to cut 3 strips of them. I'll join them together to make one nice long strap, and then I'll cut that in half. Anyway, it's just the most efficient way to do it. Now these are going to be 2-inch strips, because we're going to fold them basically in on themselves and then again, so it basically gets kind of doubled and doubled. I started out with a 1/2 yard. So I'm going to cut one 2.5-inch strip, and that'll be used for our binding. It's kind of a classic quilt binding, so if you're a quilter, you know the method for a 2.5-inch strip binding. And then I'm going to cut 7 inches for the backing. And we're cutting this larger than the finished project. We'll trim it down right before we do the binding. So it's basically the same size as our interfacing. So there's our piece for the back of our project. So now that we've done all of our cutting, we're ready for the fun part. I'm going to show you how to use that fun little gadget, the little folding tool. We're going to start with one of our nice long dark blue strips. Hopefully you can see this really nicely. So at the wide end of our little folding tool, there's an opening between the plastic and the metal. We want to put our fabric in kind of face up through that opening. Now it's hard to kind of grab the fabric. You might want to fold it over on the diagonal and kind of force it in. And you'll see it kind of start to come through the little slot. They've put a little window here that allows you to grab it with a pin. Maybe you're going to grab it with a stitch ripper, basically, or a stiletto, whatever tool you have. So you can kind of start feeding your strip through the tool. You kind of want to center it so that as it comes out the other end, basically what's happening is that the raw edges are going to come together. So you want them to come together right in the center, and then we'll be able to press it just like that as it comes out of the tool, and we'll have some perfect single fold. It's not really bias. They're called bias tape folders, but this is cut on the straight, but we'll have some perfect single fold tape ironed. So as we move the folder along, it folds more of the tape, and we just keep pressing, and it creates this beautiful, perfect little tape. I'm using steam on my iron, so it'll get a nice, good press with this cotton fabric. Hello everyone. At this point, you might notice the audio has changed. We had a bit of a problem. We lost some of our audio, so I will be doing a voiceover. So if you notice my lips are not moving at the same point as the words, that is why. So at this point, fold the straps. So the first thing we're going to do is put the pin into the ironing board, just the tip of the pin, so that it moves freely. We're going to fold our strap in half. It's a 2-inch strip. We're folding in half to 1 inch. We're going to slide it under the pin, and then we're going to stick the end of the pin into the ironing board. So that'll be the perfect width for the 1-inch folded strap to fit under the pin, and it should move freely because we're going to be sliding it under the iron. Once we've got it under the pin, we actually want to refold it so that the raw edges are facing each other, just like we did with our fabric strips for the weaving, when we want to do the same process for our straps. So we're going to follow the same process. It's not quite as accurate and exact as the bias folding tool that we have, but it is a fun little technique and something that you can use in the future. So we're going to complete this technique for all 3 strips of strap, and then we're going to move on to folding those strips in half again. So now we started with 2 inches, we folded it in half, became 1 inch, and we're folding it again, so the finished straps will be about a 1/2 inch wide. And I'm going to press all 3 of these strips to make the strap for the belt. The next thing we're going to move on to, the final long fabric strip, is the binding for our belt. As you recall, this was a 2.5 inch strip. We're going to take our 2.5 inch strip and we're going to fold it wrong sides together so the nice side of the fabric is facing out, and we're just going to line up the raw edges of the fabric, and we're going to continue to press that in half for the length of the strip. So to prepare for our weaving, we have our piece of fusible interfacing and our large piece of cardboard. We have the glue side of the interfacing facing up. We're going to center it on the board, kind of along the length and the width. And like I said, make sure that the glue side is facing up. We're going to take some of our glass head pins, and I'm going to start in one corner of the interfacing and pin it to the cardboard. And I'm just going to continue this for all 4 corners. We want it to be nice and flat. We don't want any buckles or bumps once we press this later. So once we have this pinned in place, we're ready to start placing our warp strips. So as you recall, that's the nice beautiful blue that we have. So I'm going to lay my first strip down, grab a nice glass head pin, and about 1 inch from the edge of the interfacing, I'm going to pin one end of this fabric strip down. And I'm just going to keep it nice and taut, a nice straight line. We don't want it too tight that once we remove it from the pins that it shrinks in, but it should be taut enough to keep it nice and flat and straight. And I'm going to stick another pin at the other end. And once we know the length, we can cut off the end of the strip. So that's one down, 9 to go. We're going to keep them butted right up against each other. So there we have it. All 10 strips have been pinned. Now we're ready to do the fun part of creating our pattern. So I've printed off my pattern. You could maybe figure it out on a graph paper. You maybe don't want to do the same pattern as me. We're doing this fun herringbone pattern that's kind of a mirror image from one half to the next. So I'm going to grab the first strip of the taupe fabric. We're going to start the weaving from the center. So 5 rows in, 5 strips in. We're going to look at our pattern and figure out what the first bit of color should look like. So the first thing we see is one bit of the taupe showing. So notice how that shows on that over that first strip of blue. I'm going to pin it in place. I'm going to pull that piece nice and taut to keep it straight. I'm going to trim the length that I need. We're going to try and conserve our crosswise strips as much as we can. So of course now we need to weave the other half. So this time we have a bit of blue showing first, then 2 widths of the taupe, and then 2 widths of the blue. So that's the first row of our pattern. Once it's nice and flat and smooth, we're going to put another pin in, keeping it nice and taut. For the next row, we have 2 bits of the taupe showing, 2 widths, then 2 of the blue, and then 1 of the taupe. Again, we're going to follow the same process, keeping them nice and short up together. We're going to put a pin in the taupe, hold it nice and taut, cut our strip nice and efficient. We have to weave the other half of the pattern, starting with 2 widths of the blue, then 2 widths of the taupe, and a final little width of the blue. So with every row that we do, you can see the pattern starting to form. What this is actually happening is we're creating kind of diagonal lines. With every row you can see this becoming more and more clear. So just follow along. I'm going to keep weaving until the halfway point because at that point the pattern kind of reverses itself and we have to start kind of looking at a new pattern. So the audio should pick up soon enough and we can explain what to do once all of the weaving is finished. So we've reached the halfway point of our weaving and the pattern basically changes at this point. So the last row that we did, we want to do kind of a mirror image in reverse of that one. So that means that from the center this direction, I need 2 taupe, then 2 navy, then 1 taupe. Put a pin in that. And then going from the center in the other direction, we need 2 navy showing, then 2 taupe, and then 1 navy. And we'll put a pin. Now I've noticed at my halfway point, I only have 3 strips left, so I may have to cut myself a 4th strip, so that's a total of 8. I thought we could get away with 7, but you can plan as much as you can try as much as you can to plan. And it doesn't always work out. So then the second row, our diagonals instead of going this way are going to start going this way. So that means we're going to have 1, taupe from the center here, then 2 navy, and then 2 taupe. I'm going to turn my work around so I can see what I'm doing. So I've finished all of my weaving. I did kind of manage to squeeze out the last little strip for the last row without having to cut the extra strip, so that was kind of lucky. If you need to, hopefully you have enough fabric, you can do the last couple of pieces. So the weaving's finished. I think I've done a pretty good job keeping everything straight, but I am just going to check with a ruler, see if I need to kind of tuck anything over, kind of straighten out my lines. Easier to do that now, obviously, before we press the whole thing in place. I think that's looking pretty good. So if you're happy with your weaving, we're going to bring this all over to the iron and we're going to press it all in place. So here again we have our weaving in place. Now remember, we're using glass head pins because our iron is about to get very close to our pins. So we want to make sure there are some little exposed pieces of our interfacing. We don't want our iron to touch those, so be very careful. You don't want to get glue on the underside of your iron. It would be a big mess. But we do want to press these end strips that overlap, kind of press those. That'll help hold all your weaving in place. We're going to baste it in place before we put the binding and the backing on, but that glue will hold everything in place before you have a chance to do that. So I'm going to put my iron, again being very careful not to get my interfacing. And if everyone has watched videos where I've pressed interfacing before, we lift and we move the iron over. We don't slide it. We don't want to create any bubbles or warping in our interfacing. I'm going to turn the iron so I can kind of get those sections, again avoiding the back of the interfacing here. We're going to hold the iron for about 5 or 10 seconds, then lift, move it to a new section. So I'm going to bring this back to the table where we can take all the pins out, and I'll show you how to apply the backing and the binding. So I'm just taking up the last few of the pins, the moment of truth, where we pray that our interfacing is holding all of our weaving in place. There we have it. That's looking pretty good. So the thing we want to do before we start trimming this down to the size, I'm wearing my mask, before we start trimming this down to size, I'm going to baste with a zigzag around the finished kind of size, and then once the basting's in place, I'll feel more comfortable trimming off the excess weaving. So I'll meet you at the sewing machine to do that. So I realized when I got to this point that we forgot to put the backing onto our piece. So the steps are a little bit out of order. I'm going to have to baste it in place now. I've already done my zigzag and my trimming, but we should have, when we did the zigzag, the backing should have been in place so that we were going through all 3 layers. Sorry about that. I think I got ahead of myself, a little too excited about this project. So please make sure that you do add your backing at the right spot as soon as you've removed your work from the cardboard, so you don't have to do what I've done and do an extra stitch row of stitching to hold your backing in place. So the very edge of our belt, whatever object you're making with your weaving, is going to get covered up by about a 1/4 inch of binding. So we can do a nice little zigzag stitch that's going to hold everything in place and not worry about that showing, because it's going to get covered up by the binding. So I'm setting my machine to a zigzag stitch. I'm just kind of holding all of my ends in place as I sew. When I get to the end of the long row, I'm going to leave my needle down and pivot. I'm going to do the same thing here. Leave the needle down on the left. Leave it in my work pivot. So here we have our belt weaving, backed. We've done our zigzag stitch around the outside edge. Now we still have a lot of extra of the strips kind of hanging off. So I'm just going to trim those a little bit cleaner so it's a little bit easier to do our binding. So just be very careful. I'm just basically leaving an extra ½ inch beyond my stitching. All right, so you can kind of see what we're getting close to. So remember that binding piece that we had. It was 2½ inches wide. We folded it in half, face out. We're going to line up our raw edge with the edge of our stitching. And I'm going to start sewing kind of close to one corner. We're going to do a beautiful mitered corner at each corner, but I'm going to show you that at the sewing machine. So hopefully we're all cut up in the right spot. We've got our backing on, we've got everything trimmed, a ½ inch larger than our finished belt. We're ready to put on the binding. So we've taken our 2½ inch strip, folded it wrong sides together. We're going to leave ourselves a little bit of extra overhang in order to join it when we return to that section. I'm leaving myself about 6 inches. I'm using a little bit less than 3/8 of an inch, kind of between 1/4. I'm setting back to normal stitch length. Kind of between 1/4 and 3/8, and that'll give us the right amount of binding showing on the face. So our raw edge of our binding is lining up with the outside edge of our belt. So this is a very handy little technique for anyone into quilting. Maybe you're making pot holders, this would apply. Anything where you want a nice bound edge. So as you get to the corner, about that 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch away from this end that you're sewing toward, you leave your needle in your work. You pivot your work 45 degrees. So now you're sewing on a diagonal, and you sew right to the corner. And you can sew right off the edge. So we kind of stitch down, we pivoted, and we sew it on a 45-degree angle. Then we're going to turn our work. We're going to fold along that 45-degree angle. Basically, imagine that line kind of continuing, and we're going to use that to fold our strip back, like that. And then we're going to bring the raw edge of the extension of our binding. We're still keeping that fold in place, but that raw edge now continues along the new side that we're stitching. So it's kind of like this little miter kind of inside here. We'll keep that nice and flat. Then we'll start stitching right from that creased edge at the top. We're going to do a back stitch and continue to the next corner. I'll show that one more time because it is a little bit tricky for anyone who's new to mitered corners in binding. So we sew until we're about 1/4 inch, 3/8 from the end of that row. We leave our needle in our work. We turn our work 45-degree angle and stitch on that 45-degree angle. So the fold is, we imagine that 45-degree angle continuing. We fold our tape back along that line. Then we bring that raw edge that's off of our work, we fold it back towards ourselves, and we line up that raw edge with the edge of our work. Again, we've got that nice little mitered happening there. And we start stitching right from that folded edge there. I'm going to meet you here at the sewing machine to figure out what we're going to do about finishing this off. All right, so this is a very advanced thing for anyone interested in quilting. As you can see, we've left a little extra binding here and here. We've left kind of a part that we haven't stitched the binding down yet, because we want to have kind of a hidden seam here on the bias. So the thing to do is find about the halfway point of the part that we've left open and fold your binding back at that point. I'm going to mark that point with a little bit of chalk. All right, then the other piece we're going to overlap. We want to keep these nice and taut because we want it to be nice and flat when we stitch it down. So I'm going to mark that same point on the other piece of binding. So this is where these two pieces should meet in the middle. Hopefully everyone's following that. We could cut these strips off and just sew it straight, but that would give us a big lump right there. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to cut it on the diagonal, and that's going to make the lump kind of spread over a larger space. So we have to kind of lay out our strip flat. I might have to take a few stitches out of the binding, so we can do that. There we go. Open it out. I'm just going to draw this with chalk. So imagine our stitching line first is going to be where the actual marking is. I'm going to use my 45-degree line on my ruler as a guide for my 45-degree angle here. So that's my stitching line. That's where the point is. Now I need to add a seam allowance so I can actually sew that. I'm going to draw a second line. So that's our matching point that we had done. We did a 45-degree angle for our seam, and we've added a seam allowance of a 1/2 inch. I'm going to trim that now. So now I've got to do the same thing with the other side. I'm going to use my ruler again to draw the stitching line with my chalk. Now before I cut this, I'm just going to make sure that these two kind of things fit together, and they do. So I'm going to trim that off. So now the fun part is sewing these together. I'm going to remove a couple of the stitches from my binding so I can kind of have a bit more leeway. So we basically are going to bring these two seam allowances together, and we have to offset the overlap because we want to stitch, we want them to overlap properly at the stitching line, not at the seam allowance, and then we will have a finished binding that we can then trim off the excess of the belt, wrap the binding around to the back of the belt, and hand sew it in place. I know it's a lot. You might want to be looking at these couple minutes of footage a couple of times before you attempt it. I'm going to bring this to the sewing machine and actually sew this seam so you can see what it looks like finished. So we'll do that next. So I've pinned where I need to stitch. Now again, I hope you can see this. Basically that first line that we drew, the actual stitching line, needs to line up with the stitching line on the other side, and those need to line up where we're actually going to sew. So remember, we added a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch. So finicky. There we go. Get that laying flat, lined up under our foot. 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I just want to show what that seam looks like. Hope you can see that. So we actually kind of stitched in that little valley there, and then at the end it's the same thing. So when we press this open, you can see how instead of one bulky seam going through all those layers, we've moved the seam allowance across like a 2.5 inch width so that it's not going to be so obvious and so bulky. So it's probably hard to see here, but this is the little seam that we did. I did finish that 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch seam. So this is all stitched down now. So now we're ready to trim off the final excess of the belt so that we can finish the binding. So we're going to very carefully, so that we're not cutting any of these miters, we're going to I've got 3 more sides to trim, and again I want to make sure I'm not trimming any of my beautiful binding that's going to become my miter on the back. Now we have a little bit of hand sewing to do. Basically, we're going to be wrapping that binding around to the back, and then we need to hand sew it in place. At the corners, again, to keep the bulk from all being in one place, you'll notice where we did that little miter, it's going to be a little bit bulky on this side. I can kind of feel it here. So on the back, when we wrap it around, we want the bulk on the back, so this little fold here, we want to be on this side. So we've got part of the bulk here, and then the bulk of this little fold is going to be like that, so that our finished corner will be a little bit flatter. I'm going to show you what this looks like when it's finished, when we've actually stitched it. But we have this beautiful little mitered corner on the front, and we're going to have an equally beautiful little mitered corner on the back. So here we have our almost finished belt, again through the magic of film. There's lots of magic in this film. I've done the hand sewing. If you're interested in knowing how to do an invisible slip stitch, you can look at our link here. So let's move on. The last thing we need to do is apply our straps. So as you recall, we had pressed and cut 3 lengths for the straps. I've joined them all together end to end, and I've stitched close to the fold to make it like closed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn these 3 lengths that we joined together into 2 pieces. So I'm just going to find my halfway point. I'm going to cut those straps in half, and then I will meet you at the sewing machine to show you how to stitch them to your belt. So I just want to show everyone, I mentioned that I joined the lengths together. Now I did join those on a diagonal seam for the same reason that we did a diagonal seam on our binding. It means the bulk of the seam allowance is spread over a larger area instead of having a big lumpy seam in one spot. So I just want to point that out. Of course you can join it on the straight if that's easier for you, but maybe a little bit more advanced step would be to cut your pieces on the diagonal and join them that way. Okay, so I'm going to take my first strap and I'm going to find my halfway point, and I'm going to put a pin in that. There we go, there's a pin. We're going to be joining the straps to the center of our belt on either side. Now the way we're going to do this, and I'm thinking this is pretty clever on my part, if I do say so myself, I'm going to line up the stitched edge of the strap with that inside edge of the binding, and I've lined up my pin at the halfway point of my belt. And what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to set my belt on a 45-degree angle. I'm going to my foot down. And we're going to stitch on that 45-degree angle right to that halfway point on the strap. Leave my needle in, turn my work 90 degrees. So again, we're stitching on a 45-degree angle back toward the edge of our tie. And I'm going to pivot my work all the way around, and I'm going to stitch over exactly where I stitched previously, and this will make sure that we have a very strong hold, because there will be a lot of tension on this seam because it's tying the belt to our body. And then I'm going to do a back stitch here, again just to make it nice and secure. And what we will see is that when we flip the ties away from the belt, it creates this beautiful little diagonal join. So hopefully you can see that there. We're going to do this on the other side, and then we can take a look at our finished product. All right, so I've sewn the second strap. Looks like this. I love this beautiful little point. I was going to suggest, if you can find a large bead, you can put a bead on the end of each of the straps and then tie a knot. I think that'd be a really fun way to finish it off. I'm just going to tie knots. I'll just do one. And then I'm going to show you what the belt looks like on. So here we go. Now if you're not comfortable with the belt right around your exact point of your waist, maybe you'll feel a little bit more comfortable a little bit higher up. Maybe you want something that just kind of goes on your hips, whatever you want. It's your belt. Please do what you want with it. Now you can also bring the nice long straps around to the front and tie it, or maybe you just want to have it tie in the back. Anyway, part of what I want to say is, you know, this is your project. Make it in the fabrics that you love, make it in the colors that you love, wear it the way you want to. With all of the projects that we're doing, we really want to allow you to express your creativity. Maybe you want to wear this like over your chest, like some sort of bit of armor. So please, please, please use your creativity. We've been trying to come up with a fun little sign-off that it lets you know that, you know, we should all express, you know, what we're feeling, what makes us feel good. So we've come up with Sew True and Be You. Love yourself and let people know it through your sewing. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this project. I think it's a great method. It can be used for lots of other projects. Hopefully you give this belt a try. We're going to be having an accompanying videos coming soon where we make a kimono style top that this will be perfect with. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to visit our online store, fabricana.com. Follow us on social media through Instagram and Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure that your notifications are turned on so you don't miss any fun content. So again, bye-bye. Sew True, Be You.